Chosen one. Throughout history, individuals who operate outside familiar behavioral patterns have often been misunderstood. Rather than being accurately assessed, they are frequently misjudged. In many cases, this is not because their actions lack logic, but because their reasoning does not follow conventional social expectations. The result is a recurring pattern in which unconventional thinkers are labeled as unstable, unpredictable, or irrational, when in reality, they are operating on a different analytical framework in contemporary social environments. Predictability is often equated with reliability. People who follow expected routines respond emotionally in familiar ways, and explain their decisions openly tend to be viewed as safe or trustworthy. Conversely, individuals who act independently, maintain emotional restraint, or change direction without public explanation are often regarded with suspicion. This distinction forms the foundation of many misinterpretations. The subject of this analysis is not emotional volatility or erratic behavior, but strategic independence. In many observed cases, individuals who appear inconsistent to others are not acting impulsively. Instead, they are responding to information, patterns, and long-term projections that are not immediately visible to those around them. One of the most consistent errors people make when evaluating such individuals is assuming that silence indicates confusion or social discomfort. In reality, silence often serves as a deliberate observational tool. When individuals reduce verbal engagement, they create space to assess behavior, consistency, and intent without interference. This practice is especially common among people who prioritize accuracy over immediacy. Social systems tend to reward visibility. People who speak frequently, react openly, and display emotional transparency are often perceived as engaged or sincere. However, these traits do not necessarily correlate with discernment. In many environments, those who speak the least often observe the most. Reduced verbal participation allows attention to shift toward nonverbal cues, behavioral repetition, and subtle inconsistencies that are easy to miss during constant interaction in professional and interpersonal settings alike. Individuals who operate this way are often underestimated. Their calm demeanor is mistaken for passivity. Their lack of emotional display is interpreted as detachment. Their selective engagement is framed as social difficulty. These assumptions persist until outcomes begin to contradict expectations. Another common source of misinterpretation is early decision-making. When someone withdraws from a situation, relationship, or opportunity before obvious problems surface, observers frequently describe the action as premature or exaggerated. What is often overlooked is the role of pattern recognition. Many individuals do not rely on isolated incidents to form conclusions. Instead, they monitor trends, behavioral shifts, and inconsistencies over time. Patterns provide predictive value. Small deviations in behavior, tone, or reliability may appear insignificant in isolation, but when viewed collectively, they can signal larger issues. Individuals who are attuned to these indicators often act before situations deteriorate publicly. To outside observers, these decisions seem abrupt. To the individual making them, they are the result of accumulated data. This difference in perception creates tension. People who rely on visible proof tend to trust only what is already escalated. Those who rely on pattern analysis trust indicators that suggest escalation is likely. When the latter group acts early, they are frequently criticized for overreacting. When events later unfold as anticipated, the same decisions are reinterpreted as foresight. Emotional regulation is another area where misunderstanding frequently occurs. Many social dynamics depend on emotional reciprocity. Raised voices, visible frustration, defensive explanations, and expressive reactions serve as cues that others rely on to gauge influence and control. When someone does not respond in expected ways, it disrupts these dynamics. Individuals who maintain emotional composure during provocation are often described as cold or detached. In practice, emotional restraint usually reflects discipline rather than indifference. The ability to pause, process information, and choose responses carefully reduces vulnerability to manipulation. This approach is particularly effective in environments where emotional reactions are used as leverage. Psychological studies consistently show that people feel most comfortable when they can predict emotional responses. Predictability allows for adjustment, persuasion, and, in some cases, control. When predictability is absent, uncertainty increases. This uncertainty is often projected as criticism toward the individual who caused it, that another frequently misinterpreted. Behavior is the use of questioning rather than confrontation. In discussions where information accuracy matters, asking simple, direct questions can reveal inconsistencies more effectively than debate. Clear questions require clear answers. When answers change, become defensive, or lack coherence, discrepancies become visible. People who rely on deception or exaggeration tend to struggle under scrutiny, even when that scrutiny is calm and neutral. As a result, individuals who ask precise questions are sometimes accused of being suspicious or confrontational, despite maintaining a measured tone. The discomfort experienced by others is not caused by aggression, but by exposure. Over time, this pattern reinforces negative labeling. Rather than acknowledging gaps in their own narratives, people may shift blame onto the person asking questions. This deflection preserves comfort while avoiding accountability. For the observer, the response confirms the validity of their concerns. Early withdrawal from unstable situations is another behavior commonly misjudged. In many cases, individuals who leave before conflict escalates are perceived as avoiding difficulty. In reality, early exit often reflects risk assessment. When the cost of continued involvement outweighs potential benefit, disengagement becomes a rational choice. This approach is particularly evident in interpersonal relationships. When respect diminishes or boundaries are repeatedly tested, some individuals attempt repair through explanation or negotiation. Others conclude that continued engagement is unlikely to produce improvement. Choosing distance in such cases is not an emotional reaction, but a strategic decision. Social norms often discourage abrupt disengagement. Explanations are expected. Closure is demanded. However, not all situations warrant further discussion. In some cases, silence communicates boundaries more effectively than argument. The absence of justification prevents continued manipulation and preserves autonomy. Another area where misunderstanding occurs is humor. Humor that highlights uncomfortable truths is often labeled as cynical or inappropriate. Yet such humor frequently reflects awareness rather than negativity. By drawing attention to inconsistencies, hypocrisy, or unrealistic expectations, it exposes realities that others prefer to ignore. Dark or blunt humor functions as a coping mechanism for individuals who perceive systems clearly. Rather than denying complexity or injustice, they acknowledge it openly. This approach can make others uncomfortable, particularly those invested in maintaining optimistic narratives. The discomfort, however, stems from recognition, not offense. Periods of withdrawal or reduced visibility are also commonly misinterpreted. When individuals step back without explanation, assumptions often follow. Observers may speculate about instability, confusion, or failure. In many cases, withdrawal serves a practical purpose: recalibration. Distance allows individuals to evaluate their environment without constant influence. It creates space for analysis, learning, and preparation. This practice is common among strategists, analysts, and planners across multiple fields. Visibility is reduced not because capacity is lost, but because focus is redirected. During these periods, individuals often gather information, refine skills, and assess long-term positioning. When they re-engage, their actions appear decisive and well-timed. To those unaware of the preparation phase, this can seem sudden or surprising. Trust evaluation is another defining characteristic. Rather than relying on verbal assurances, some individuals prioritize consistency. Promises are considered secondary to repeated behavior. This approach reduces susceptibility to manipulation and disappointment. Many people experience repeated setbacks because they assign credibility to intention rather than action. By contrast, those who evaluate patterns over time develop more accurate expectations. This method is not cynical. It is evidence-based. A further misconception arises around the refusal to explain oneself. In many social contexts, transparency is expected. However, explanations can also provide leverage. Each justification reveals priorities, vulnerabilities, and thresholds. Individuals who understand this dynamic often limit what they disclose. Accepting misunderstanding can be a strategic choice. When others misinterpret behavior, they often reveal their own assumptions and biases. The individual being misjudged gains insight without reciprocating exposure. Over time, this imbalance creates informational advantage. This approach requires confidence and restraint. Many people feel compelled to correct misperceptions. Doing so repeatedly can be exhausting and counterproductive. By allowing incorrect assumptions to persist, individuals reduce interference and maintain flexibility. Across these behaviors, silence, early withdrawal, emotional regulation, pattern recognition, selective engagement, a consistent theme merges. What is frequently labeled as instability is, in many cases, structured thinking applied quietly. The tendency to label what cannot be easily categorized reflects a broader social discomfort with deviation. Systems favor conformity because it simplifies interaction. Those who operate independently challenge that simplicity. As outcomes accumulate, miscalculations become evident. Decisions that once appeared erratic demonstrate consistency. Predictions prove accurate. Boundaries preserve stability. Preparation reveals itself through results. This leads to a gradual reassessment. Laughter becomes cautious. Dismissal turns into observation. What was once called madness begins to resemble precision. This transition marks the point where misjudgment is exposed. The individual was not disoriented. They were operating with foresight, and this is where the analysis continues. Once miscalculation becomes visible, the social dynamic shifts. Those who initially dismissed or minimized the individual's choices begin to reassess their assumptions. This reassessment rarely occurs openly. Instead, it unfolds quietly through altered behavior, increased observation, and subtle changes in interaction. What was once treated casually becomes measured. What was once mocked becomes monitored. This shift does not happen because perceptions suddenly improve, but because outcomes force reevaluation. When predictions align with reality, when early withdrawals prevent later damage, and when restraint avoids escalation, the narrative of instability becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. At this point, observers are faced with a choice: adjust their interpretation or protect their original judgment. Many choose the latter. Rather than acknowledging misjudgment, they reinterpret past behavior to preserve their sense of accuracy. Silence is reframed as secrecy. Independence is reframed as arrogance. Emotional regulation is reframed as emotional distance. These reinterpretations allow observers to maintain psychological consistency while avoiding accountability for earlier assumptions. This defensive reinterpretation is common in environments where status depends on perceived insight. Admitting error threatens credibility. As a result, the individual who was misjudged often continues to be misunderstood, even as evidence contradicts the original assessment. The misunderstanding persists not because of lack of information, but because of resistance to correction. At the same time, those who operate with foresight rarely seek validation. Their focus remains on outcomes rather than recognition. This creates an asymmetry. One side is invested in narrative control, while the other is invested in execution. Over time, execution carries greater weight. As this dynamic unfolds, a second pattern emerges: selective engagement from others. Individuals who previously dismissed the person begin to seek proximity, advice, or alignment. This interest is often indirect. Questions become more frequent. Opinions are requested casually. Observations are tested through conversation. This behavior reflects uncertainty rather than respect. Observers are attempting to recalibrate without openly admitting misjudgment. They seek information while preserving deniability. For the individual being observed, this shift is noticeable. Discernment becomes critical at this stage. Not all renewed interest is constructive. Some interactions are driven by curiosity, others by opportunism. Distinguishing between the two requires continued pattern recognition. Trust evaluation becomes stricter. Past behavior carries weight. Consistency matters more than tone. Promises remain secondary to follow through. This approach limits vulnerability and prevents repetition of earlier mistakes. Another development during this phase is increased projection. When observers recognize that they misjudge someone's capacity, they often project motives to explain the discrepancy. Strategic thinking is framed as manipulation. Emotional restraint is framed as detachment. Independence is framed as lack of empathy. These projections serve a psychological function. They reduce discomfort by assigning negative intent to what was previously misunderstood. This allows observers to maintain moral positioning even while acknowledging competence. For the individual being projected upon, this can create isolation. Accurate assessment does not always lead to acceptance. In some cases, it increases distance. The realization that someone was not confused but observant can make others uneasy. This unease stems from exposure. Strategic individuals often see dynamics others overlook. Their presence can create a sense of being evaluated, even when no judgment is expressed. This perceived scrutiny can trigger defensiveness. As a result, some relationships naturally thin out. Interactions become more formal. Emotional access becomes limited. This is not necessarily a loss. It reflects realignment rather than rejection. During this period, internal stability becomes increasingly important. External validation remains inconsistent. Praise may appear alongside suspicion. Interest may coexist with distance. Navigating these mixed signals requires clarity of purpose. Clarity here does not mean rigidity. It means knowing which outcomes matter. The focus remains on sustainability rather than approval. Decisions continue to prioritize long-term impact over short-term comfort. Another consequence of reassessment is increased expectation. Once competence is recognized, standards rise. Errors are scrutinized more closely. Silence is interpreted more carefully. Independence is monitored rather than dismissed. This increased scrutiny can feel restrictive. However, it also signals acknowledgement of capability. People do not monitor what they consider irrelevant. Attention, even when cautious, reflects perceived significance. Managing this attention requires restraint. Over-explanation invites interference. Under-communication creates speculation. Balance becomes essential. Information is shared intentionally rather than reactively. At this stage, many individuals refine their boundaries further. Access becomes conditional. Engagement becomes selective. This is not an act of withdrawal, but of prioritization. Energy management becomes central. Not all interactions deserve equal investment. Some conversations drain focus. Others contribute insight. Learning to differentiate between the two preserves effectiveness. This phase also exposes a broader social tendency, the reluctance to acknowledge foresight. Many systems reward reaction rather than anticipation. Problems are addressed once visible, not when predictable. Individuals who act early disrupt this pattern. Early action challenges the assumption that escalation is necessary for legitimacy. It demonstrates that prevention can be more effective than response. This challenges established norms and can create resistance. Resistance often appears as dismissal until outcomes force recognition. Even then, acknowledgement is rare. Instead, early action is reframed as coincidence or luck. This reframing protects existing structures. For the individual, this reinforces a key lesson. Validation is not guaranteed. Accuracy does not always produce acknowledgement. Effectiveness does not always result in appreciation. Understanding this reduces frustration. Expectations adjust. The focus remains on alignment rather than recognition. Over time, a consistent track record begins to speak independently. Decisions compound. Outcomes align. Stability becomes evident. The narrative gradually shifts from speculation to observation. This shift does not produce dramatic change. It produces subtle respect. Interactions become cautious. Opinions are weighed. Assumptions are softened. At this point, the individual is no longer underestimated, but not fully understood. This middle ground is often ideal. It allows freedom of movement without excessive interference. Maintaining this position requires discipline. Visibility is managed. Communication remains precise. Emotional responses remain measured. Consistency reinforces credibility. Another important development is the internal recalibration of identity. When misjudgment persists despite evidence, it becomes clear that self-definition must remain internal. Identity cannot rely on external agreement. This internal grounding reduces the need to correct others. Misunderstanding becomes tolerable rather than threatening. Focus shifts from perception to execution. As this grounding strengthens, adaptability improves. New environments are assessed quickly. Patterns are identified early. Engagement is strategic. This adaptability does not imply detachment from values. On the contrary, values become clearer. Boundaries sharpen. Compromises are evaluated carefully. The individual learns when to engage and when to disengage without explanation. Silence becomes a tool rather than a defense. Distance becomes a strategy rather than a reaction. Over time, this approach reduces conflict. Situations that would have escalated are avoided entirely. Energy is conserved. Focus remains intact. Another outcome of this phase is selective alliance. Not everyone requires equal access. Relationships form around mutual respect rather than convenience. Collaboration becomes intentional. These alliances are often quiet. They lack performance. They are built on shared understanding rather than shared exposure. Their strength lies in reliability. As the social environment adjusts, the individual continues operating without needing to correct the narrative. Outcomes accumulate. Consistency persists. Eventually, the label of unpredictability dissolves. It is replaced by a quieter recognition, discernment. The behavior was not random. It was selective. The individual was not disconnected. They were observant. They were not reactive. They were deliberate. And the silence that once caused confusion becomes understood as preparation rather than absence. This is not a conclusion. It is a continuation. The analysis moves forward from here. As this stage unfolds, The most significant change is not external recognition, but internal consolidation. By the time patterns have repeated often enough to confirm accuracy, the individual no longer requires validation to maintain confidence. Decisions are no longer influenced by whether they will be understood in the moment. They are guided by coherence, sustainability, and consequence. This shift marks the point at which strategy becomes habitual rather than deliberate. Early on, restraint requires effort. Silence must be chosen. Distance must be maintained consciously. Over time, these behaviors integrate naturally into decision-making. They are no longer tactics. They become default responses shaped by experience. One of the clearest indicators of this integration is the reduction of emotional reactivity. Not because emotion is suppressed, but because fewer situations provoke it. Many triggers lose their power once patterns are recognized early. When escalation is predictable, it can be avoided. When manipulation is recognizable, it can be ignored. Emotional energy is conserved rather than expended. This conservation has compounding effects. With fewer distractions, attention sharpens. With less noise, judgment improves. Decisions become more efficient because they are not burdened by unnecessary emotional processing. The result is a sense of steadiness that others often misinterpret as detachment. In reality, this steadiness reflects engagement at a deeper level. The individual is not disengaged from outcomes, but from volatility. This distinction is often overlooked. Many environments mistake intensity for commitment. When intensity is absent, commitment is questioned. Yet consistency over time demonstrates engagement more reliably than visible urgency. As consistency becomes evident, another shift occurs in how others interact. Requests become more intentional. Conversations become more measured. There is less casual intrusion and more deliberate approach. This change is subtle, but it reflects an unspoken acknowledgement of boundaries. Boundaries, at this stage, are not defensive. They are structural. They define capacity and protect focus. Rather than being explained repeatedly, they are demonstrated through behavior. Access is regulated by responsiveness. Engagement is determined by alignment rather than obligation. This approach reduces conflict. When expectations are set through action rather than explanation, misunderstandings decrease. People adapt to what is consistently reinforced. Over time, the environment reorganizes itself around these parameters. Another outcome of sustained alignment is predictability of results without predictability of behavior. While actions may appear selective or minimal, outcomes remain reliable. This combination creates an impression of control without overt exertion. Control, in this context, does not imply dominance. It implies management of variables. By reducing exposure to unnecessary risk, volatility decreases. By choosing engagements carefully, leverage increases. This is not achieved through force, but through selectivity. As leverage increases, pressure from others often intensifies. Expectations rise. Demands become more frequent. This is a critical juncture. Yielding indiscriminately can compromise alignment. Refusal without clarity can create friction. Navigating this requires discernment rather than resistance. Some requests align with long-term objectives. Others serve short-term convenience for others. Differentiating between the two preserves integrity. Integrity, at this stage, is operational rather than symbolic. It is reflected in consistent decision criteria. Similar situations receive similar responses. Exceptions are rare and intentional. This predictability reinforces trust among those who observe closely. Trust, however, is not distributed broadly. It remains selective. The individual has learned that proximity does not equal reliability. Shared space does not guarantee shared values. As a result, trust is extended gradually and based on evidence. This evidence-based approach affects Relationships across contexts. Personal, professional, and collaborative interactions are evaluated through the same lens. Emotional attachment does not override pattern recognition. Optimism does not replace verification. This does not lead to cynicism. It leads to realism. Expectations are calibrated. Disappointment decreases because assumptions are grounded. When outcomes diverge from expectation, adjustment occurs without collapse. Another defining feature of this phase is reduced need for narrative control. Early misjudgment often creates a desire to correct perception. Over time, that desire fades. The individual recognizes that narratives shift naturally in response to outcomes. Attempting to manage perception consumes energy and invites interference. Allowing outcomes to speak independently preserves autonomy. This approach accepts temporary misunderstanding in exchange for long-term clarity. As this acceptance deepens, the individual becomes more comfortable operating without explanation. Silence is no longer defensive. It is efficient. It communicates boundaries without argument. This efficiency extends to problem solving. Challenges are addressed at the structural level rather than the surface level. Symptoms are not mistaken for causes. Adjustments target systems rather than reactions. Systemic thinking distinguishes this stage from earlier phases. Rather than focusing on isolated issues, the individual evaluates interdependencies. Small changes are made where they will have disproportionate impact. This method reduces workload while increasing effectiveness. Effort is allocated strategically. Not everything requires attention. Not every problem requires engagement. The ability to ignore irrelevant stimuli becomes as valuable as the ability to act. This selective focus protects momentum. It prevents fragmentation of energy. Over time, this creates a form of quiet authority. Not authority granted by position or recognition, but authority derived from reliability. People learn that when this individual engages, it matters. When they withdraw, it is intentional. This understanding alters group dynamics. Influence increases without escalation. Presence becomes meaningful rather than constant. Absence becomes informative rather than concerning. Such influence is difficult to challenge because it does not rely on visibility. It operates through consistency. Attempts to undermine it often fail due to lack of contradiction in behavior. Another consequence of this phase is the normalization of solitude. Solitude is no longer interpreted as lack, but as resource. Time alone becomes a space for recalibration rather than avoidance. This recalibration maintains alignment as environments change. Growth alters context. New challenges emerge. Without regular recalibration, misalignment can develop gradually. By maintaining this practice, the individual remains adaptable without losing coherence. Values remain stable even as strategies evolve. This balance between stability and adaptability is critical. Rigidity limits growth. Excessive flexibility erodes identity. Alignment requires both structure and responsiveness. As this balance is maintained, the individual moves beyond reactionary cycles. Life becomes less about responding to external pressure and more about executing internal clarity. This does not eliminate uncertainty. It reframes it. Uncertainty becomes informational rather than threatening. It signals areas requiring observation rather than immediate action. This reframing reduces anxiety. When uncertainty is tolerated, impulsive decisions decrease. Patience becomes practical rather than aspirational. Patience here is not waiting passively. It is allowing conditions to clarify before committing resources. It reflects confidence in timing rather than urgency. Over time, this confidence becomes evident in outcomes. Opportunities align more naturally. Resistance decreases. Progress feels steadier, even if less dramatic. This steadiness often contrasts sharply with earlier phases marked by volatility and misjudgment. The contrast highlights how much was learned during periods of misunderstanding. Those periods were not obstacles. They were filters. They refined discernment. They exposed dynamics that would have remained hidden in more comfortable circumstances. By navigating those phases without abandoning alignment, the individual developed resilience that now supports sustainability. At this stage, the focus shifts from proving capability to preserving it. Maintenance becomes as important as momentum. Systems are reviewed. Boundaries are reinforced. Drift is corrected early. This maintenance work is rarely visible. It lacks recognition. Yet, it is the foundation of long-term effectiveness. Many trajectories fail not due to lack of insight, but due to neglect of upkeep. Alignment erodes quietly when maintenance is ignored. By prioritizing maintenance, the individual avoids dramatic collapse. Adjustments remain small. Course correction is continuous rather than reactive. As a result, progress appears uneventful from the outside. Internally, it is intentional and controlled. This is the outcome of sustained discernment. Not spectacle, not vindication, but stability. The individual is no longer defined by misjudgment, nor by the effort to overcome it. They are defined by consistency. What once appeared unpredictable is now understood as selective. What once seemed distant is now recognized as deliberate. The process continues, not because something is unresolved, but because alignment requires continuation. There is no final arrival, only ongoing execution. And in that execution, clarity is no longer sought. It is maintained. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to pause before moving on. Reflection is part of alignment. When content reaches you at the right time, it's not by accident, it's because you were ready to receive it. If you found value in this breakdown, support the channel by engaging with it in a meaningful way. Liking the video helps ensure that this type of grounded, thoughtful analysis continues to reach people who are searching for clarity rather than noise. Subscribing allows you to stay connected to future discussions that explore transformation, discernment, and long-term personal alignment without unnecessary dramatization. Sharing this video is another way to contribute. Not everyone is looking for surface-level motivation. Some are quietly navigating complex shifts and need language that helps them understand what they are experiencing. If you know someone who may benefit from this perspective, passing it along could provide insight at a critical moment. Your comments also matter. If something in this message stood out to you, whether it confirms something you already sensed or helped you see a situation more clearly, leave a comment below. Thoughtful engagement creates dialogue, and dialogue sharpens understanding for everyone involved. You don't need to explain everything. Even a brief acknowledgement helps mark that this message reached the right audience. For those who are new here, this channel is dedicated to delivering calm, structured insight rather than emotional escalation. Each video is designed to be listened to more than once, allowing ideas to settle and meaning to deepen over time. If that approach aligns with how you process change and growth, you're in the right place. Finally, remember that progress does not always announce itself. Sometimes the most significant shifts happen quietly, through clarity, restraint, and consistent action. Stay attentive, stay grounded, and continue choosing alignment over distraction. Thank you for spending your time here. Your presence supports this work more than you may realize.